Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting out of bed. I'm always impressed. Got a serious Protestant work ethic down here in Washington. The Calvinist, Confucian, wherever else you want to describe work ethic. But it's good to be among you. And thank you, Wendy, for the introduction. And John Negroponte, who is co-chair of the Asia Society Policy Institute Advisory Council. I was speaking with John this morning just before I came down here, and you are privileged to have with you a man who represents extraordinary historical continuity. John reminded me that his first visit to China was in 1972 with Henry Kissinger. And he had one throwaway line, which was, Zhou Enlai wasn't a bad guy. Wish I could say that. I never met Zhou Enlai. But, John, it's really valuable to have you with us because one thing those of us who have long been fascinated with the Middle Kingdom value is a level of continuing historical knowledge. So we thank you for your service in public office here in the United States, but also your knowledge, which for us is important. I also noticed that Wendy acknowledged Young China Watchers. How many of you are Young China Watchers? Okay, good on you. This is an arduous path that you have chosen. And guess what? When you were our age, you will look back and say, what on earth was I thinking? Because China will never get out of your veins, and nor should it. It's both the antiquity and continuity of the civilization, the complexity of the modern Chinese nation-state, its rise and all of that, which commands serious and focused intellectual attention. And so for those of you who have embarked upon this path, I would say the first principle is yu yan wei gang, which is language comes first. And the second is understanding history, understanding historical context. I addressed a group of Young China Watchers a couple of months ago in London, and it was a packed room, 100 Young China Watchers in London. And so I thought this is, for me, gives me encouragement for the future. So well done, those of you who have engaged the field. It's difficult to begin talking about either China or the U.S.-China relationship today, of all days, when we see this unfolding tragedy, a human tragedy in China itself, the coronavirus. And so whatever else is going on in Chinese politics, our perceptions of it, U.S.-China relations, our perceptions of it, let's just reflect for a moment with some genuine human solidarity on what is an unfolding human tragedy in China itself. Not just for the good people of Wuhan, a city where I've spent a lot of time over the years. It's a great Chinese city in history and a vibrant city in the modern Chinese economy, a vast city. But also the fear and anxiety right across China itself in so many centres. A death toll of 100 plus, 2,000 or 3,000 people known to be infected, many thousands more suspected to be infected, and the genuine anxiety about the future. And so for all of us, whatever our views, I think this is an important time to reflect our solidarity with the good people of China as they deal with this deep human anxiety. And we wish Godspeed to those working on the coronavirus vaccine and their important work being undertaken in laboratories across China and across the world as we speak. We're here today to launch The Thoughts of Kevin. This thing here, it's not as intellectual as other thoughts that have been published. The Avoidable War, the subtitle, The Case for Managed Strategic Competition. Many people have asked me, why do you use the term 可避免战争, the avoidable war? Well, we're fairly direct people in Australia. We'd rather you avoided war. But it's also a partial response to the book produced by my friend and colleague from the Belfer Centre at Harvard, Graham Allison, whose book Destined for War was published only 2 or 3 years ago. And the publishers of Graham's book, wanting to sell a book, gave it that title. If you actually read the book, it's more a complex case than that. It examines 16 historical case studies of great powers existing and rising in the last 500 years of history, and points to certain probabilities, not inevitabilities, probabilities. So the poetic license taken in a title destined for war overstates Graham's proposition considerably. But it's a proposition which has gained, in my view, some currency here in Washington and a lot of currency in Beijing. And therefore it warrants, in my view, a considered set of analytical and, shall I say, policy responses to that proposition of inevitability. And hence my argument about avoidability. And I mean avoidability in terms of cold wars, warm wars, and hot wars. And so that in part is why we have begun this series. Not each of the essays contained within it deals with the absolute machinery of the relationship. It deals with other aspects of Chinese domestic politics, China's economics, as well as the physicality of the U.S.-China relationship. But the overall proposition, both in the volume we released 12 months ago and in this volume, and a book I'm working on at the moment by the same title, is if these two great countries and civilizations put their minds to it through the ancient craft of diplomacy, then there's a way through this. But it takes serious intellectual effort and serious conceptual frameworks agreed to on both parts. When we look at the concept of what is driving the thesis that these two countries are inevitably destined for one form of conflict or another, of course, those supporting the argument say this is structurally inevitable. The United States, the established great power, the established superpower, uncontested since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, is now, for the first time, challenged by a country of comparable critical mass in terms of its sheer economic heft and weight, as well as the dimensions of its unfolding global and regional, in particular, military capabilities, both conventional and nuclear. And that is the logic, that as China's critical mass in both those articulations of national power becomes greater relative to the United States, then it creates the circumstances described in the historical case studies which Graham Allison alludes to in his book. That's the structural factor at work, writ large or writ small. I, however, come from a different school of international relations theory and practice, which is one which believes in agency, and that is the agency of diplomacy, and that actually believes that decisions by women and men in leadership around the world actually matters and changes the course of history, and can change it in either profoundly positive or profoundly negative directions. And therefore, our responsibility for those who are diplomatic actors today is to argue conceptual frameworks which recognize the unfolding strategic reality, which understand the dynamics of the balance of power, which don't create what I describe as castles in the air of a utopian universe dreamt of by Immanuel Kant a couple of hundred years ago and articulated through the 14 points of President Wilson's Charter for the League of Nations. No, anchored deeply in the balance of power and those realities, but more reflective of the strategic realism which characterized the then US-Soviet relationship, apply some of the principles of the period of détente in that relationship to our current strategic realities. And that is very much the set of arguments unpacked in this particular set of essays. And for those of you who are interested in digging down as to what I actually mean by that, I draw your attention in particular to the record of the dialogue between myself and Graham Allison at the Harvard Kennedy Forum in December last year in Cambridge, which is Graham and I, politely, friendly, but in a firm way, exchanging ideas on what might constitute an effective intellectual and policy framework for diplomatic actors seeking to manage the long-term stability of the US-China relationship without simply conceding to the structural determinism that because of the competing sizes of these two giant elephants in the global living room, that we're therefore somehow destined to the inevitability of human conflict. Let me just speak for a bit on the organising principles of what I describe as managed strategic competition. And again, I draw your attention to Chapter 7 of this 7-part small volume. 5 years ago at Harvard, when I was first invited there by Graham as a political exile from Australian politics and seeking sanctuary and protection from the Australian authorities who were in search of me, having fled high office. I worked for 1 year on a piece of analysis entitled Constructive Realism, an intellectual framework for US-China relations under Xi Jinping. Then the assumptions were we were dealing with a continuing Xi Jinping, Obama, and likely to be Xi Jinping and Hillary Clinton set of analytical assumptions. Of course, things have changed. There's now someone else in Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm reliably advised. He maintains a quiet and low profile and occasionally chooses to communicate with the outside world using some of the devices of social media, I'm reliably informed. But the organisational framework contained in the original piece of research, which you can see also online from the Asia Society, is pretty simple. Constructive realism. What's by realism, and I'm drawing on a body of analytical work going back to von Clausewitz and the modern pioneers of realist thinking in this country, Morgenthau, as well as Waltz and others. But the practitioners, for whom the organising principle is the balance of power, is you can't wish that away. When China looks at strategic reality, its strategic reality is, to deploy the old Soviet term, what is the current correlation of forces between China and the United States, measured against all the indices of power? What is China's aggregate economic power? What are the sub-drivers of that in terms of the availability of human capital, physical population, energy, resources, as well as technology and the other drivers of economic size, capability and sophistication? China analyses all these things. And therefore, when you look at the military equivalent of that, which is conventional capabilities, nuclear capabilities, those within theatre, those beyond theatre, those applied to Taiwan, those not applied to Taiwan, this is all part of a wider calculus. And I'm here to say to you, this is not just the preoccupation of the PLA, it's also the preoccupation of the Pentagon and what is now called Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. So for those of us who want to, as it were, preserve the strategic peace, this cannot be divorced, that idea and ambition cannot be divorced from that underlying strategic reality, the balance of power. It's there. And there's a rolling calculus of what it is, both in the economic and security domains. And of course, these are then given further articulation in the realm of, let's call it, political and foreign policy influence. As third parties, third countries, begin to look at the change in the calculus of the balance of power in the region, then third parties, according to the international relations theorists, and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence to back this up, either balance, that is, join with one side and balancing against the other. They bandwagon, that is, once they conclude that the game might be over, they bandwagon with the likely winner, or they hedge. That is, we're not quite sure who's going to win. And if we were actually to look at the strategic and foreign policy behaviours of many regional states at the moment, they tend to follow one or other of those categorisations. But that is, let's call it, the realist dimension of what I described before as constructive realism. What's the constructive side? Well, I go back to my dichotomy before, that I articulated before, between structure and agency. If realism and the balance of power is the structure, underpinning structure of the realities we see unfolding and the dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship and how third countries perceive it, the agency, the constructive agency, lies in the diplomacy of leaders. And therefore, what diplomatic actors seek to do in managing and guiding and shaping that underlying strategic competition defined through the concepts of the balance of power. And these diplomatic actors, these constructive diplomatic actors, are not simply passive observers, waving their hands haplessly and helplessly on the side, saying goodbye to peace, welcome crisis, conflict and war. No, they're not. And the history of diplomacy, diplomatic histories of this relationship will indicate on multiple occasions, including when John Negroponte has been in office in one capacity or another, when active diplomacy intervened not just to diffuse a particular crisis, but to articulate a framework within which crises could be managed longer term. We don't have time this morning to go into the sub-detail of all of the above. But my overall point is that diplomacy matters. Diplomatic actors matter, but they doubly matter when they are operating within a wider framework. My second point to you this morning is, what is the wider framework? The wider framework I'd point to is America's deep learnings from the crisis in US-Soviet relations in the 1960s. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963 will understand that things got very close. Without rehearsing the history of the crisis, and the great historian of the crisis, by the way, is Graham Allison, and his seminal text, Essence of Decision, on the decision-making processes on both sides as it related to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The long institutional learning by the United States and the Soviets during the 1960s, and certainly following the removal of Khrushchev, was to augur in a period of to welcome in a period of détente. And when we look back at what détente was, it looks far simpler in the retrospective reconstruction than it was in the active articulation of it at the time, when people were legitimately pushing into the dark. But its organizing principle was these two highly competitive great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, could, at the highest levels of political leadership, agree on a framework which was not going to push the relationship and the world across a brink. That was its organizing principle. And within it, at the highest levels of political exchange between Brezhnev and a series of American political leaders from that time on, was that there were certain red lines not to be crossed. That's my second point. My third, and I conclude with this, is therefore what are the organising principles of what I call managed strategic competition today? I would simply argue the following. This administration, the Trump administration, and the national security strategy released at the end of 2017 formally repudiated the age of strategic engagement between the United States and China as a thing of the past, and as a framework for analysis which did not achieve its desired results. I'll leave that debate for another day as to whether it did or whether it didn't, or whether it partly achieved its objectives or not. But it said we have now entered into a new period of strategic competition. It leaves undefined what actually that means. It leaves undefined what the precise articulation of that concept means in the operational strategy of the United States across all agencies, state, the Pentagon, the military, the economy. But we see some of the resonances of it through the execution of the trade war. We see some of the resonances of it through, shall we say, changing American postures on the Taiwan question. We see other resonances of it as well. Interestingly, China itself, at the highest levels of national strategy, have not declared in parallel terms that we are therefore in a period of strategic competition with the United States. That has been left to one side, as the Chinese internal processes are now underway to formally review their own global strategic settings, most particularly in relation to this relationship. But if you accept the proposition, at least from the American side, and de facto, perhaps from the Chinese side, that this is now a demonstrably and self-defined competitive strategic relationship, I conclude by saying this: what are its organising principles? You can either just sail into the sunset and say, well, we're now competitors, this could end very badly, or it could be okay. It could be peaceful competition, it could be difficult competition, it could be in-your-face competition, it could be adversarial competition, it could be military confrontation, competition, containment, crisis, and conflict. And we all know from diplomatic history how easy these things are to see escalate. So my argument about the 5 principles for managed strategic competition as opposed to unmanaged strategic competition is as follows. 1, it must be anchored in the reality of the balance of power. And therefore, if you simply try to create an idealist diplomatic castle in the air detached from the underpinnings of the balance of power, both objectively and as perceived in both capitals, it won't work. China respects power. I'm a student of China. I have been since the last days of the Cultural Revolution. China, when it sees other countries, it is deeply respectful of national power. It's not that it's not respectful of other factors as well, but it's deeply respectful and fundamentally respectful of power. It's also a product of China's own communist tradition. You look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, the fact it fought a civil war between 1921, really 1927, through until 1949 in 2 large stretches with a war against Japan in the middle. The bottom line is our Chinese friends, when they look at this relationship, do see it through the lens of power. So this must be principle number 1. But principle number 2 is, drawing on the traditions of détente, the 2 leaders of the 2 countries must similarly agree on their own internal red lines for managing the relationship, lines which cannot be crossed. 3, red lines having been clearly communicated, privately but not publicly in my view, then the next step in this 5-part set of concepts is to define those areas in the relationship, the strategic relationship, which are difficult but doable. The usual example I give, presentations like this, is the question of Korean denuclearization. Important for both sides in different ways. But if it was to be achieved, an enormous addition to, let's call it, the bilateral political and diplomatic capital between Washington and Beijing. 4, those parts of the relationship which should be normal as far as continuing global engagement, cooperation, and producing global public goods. Obviously, depending on your political point of view in this country, I would argue, however, that must have as front and centre climate change collaboration. But given the remarks I've already just made on the question of global pandemics, this also is a demonstrable global public good where the 2 countries, the 2 administrations, must, as a matter of natural expression of their own national interests, construct effective global agreements which benefit not just themselves but the rest of the human family as well. Principle number 4. And principle number 5 is, if there is an ideational debate between the 2 countries, not as sharp as the Cold War between Soviet communism and Western capitalism, but if there is one which is about China's understanding of what constitutes the China model, the China development model, or what we in the West would describe as its own form of authoritarian capitalism or state capitalism, and if Xi Jinping and others believe this is now a credible alternative development model for the rest of the world, and the United States and others actually have a different view that liberal democracy and liberal capitalism remain valid concepts, then let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. And classical Chinese expression, which is let us see which of these 2 sides prevails around the world. And if we have confidence in our body of ideas, those of us who come from the Western tradition, that liberal democracy and liberal capitalism with rolling refinements over time, particularly given the challenges of global development, where many of the models have been less successful, if we have confidence that's going to succeed, then it will. If our Chinese friends have confidence that their alternative model will succeed, then it will. Or it will be a messy combination of the above. So my argument to conclude is this. Looking at those 5 principles, balance of power, difficult and dangerous areas where the two countries should identify red lines, difficult and dangerous areas, however, where they can collaborate and cooperate, obvious areas for engagement and cooperation, plus may the best man or woman win in the global battle for ideas. These, I believe, are the organising principles for managed strategic competition. And it's around that concept that this set of essays is launched today. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Ambassador John Negroponte. As Kevin mentioned in his remarks, diplomacy matters. And I can't think of a more effective and a more distinguished diplomat than John Negroponte. He's had a very long and distinguished career serving as ambassadors to a number of countries, including Mexico, the Philippines, Honduras, the United Nations, and Iraq. He has worked on the National Security Council, was the first director of the Director of National Intelligence, and was Deputy Secretary of State. He now serves as Vice Chairman of McLarty Associates. He is an Asia Society trustee and the co-chair of the Asia Society Policy Institute Advisory Council, and just an incredibly close friend and strong supporter of the work that we do here in ASPI, both in New York and Washington. So without further ado, let me introduce John to the stage. He will lead a moderated discussion with Kevin Rudd, and then we'll be opening it up to questions. So use the time to think about some of the questions you might want to ask this distinguished group of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for the tremendous work that you do on behalf of ASPI down here in Washington. I think I've been a trustee of the Asia Society since the inception of ASPI, and I really think it was an inspired decision on their part. And we're so fortunate to have been able to recruit Kevin Rudd to lead that effort, and I think you've really made a tremendous mark on the think tank world here in the United States, among the many other things that you are engaged in. Kevin mentioned the fact that I had first went to China in 1972 with Henry Kissinger. Actually, I was a vice consul in Hong Kong, which we didn't call China then. It was a British Crown colony. But I was a vice consul in Hong Kong back in 1961. So I had a bit of a window on China to the extent that you could see through the border at that time.
What was the Qing dynasty like? Were you there?
What?
Were you there for the Qing dynasty? Sorry, disrespectful remarks. I'm an Australian.
Anyway, I never thought when I started my career in Hong Kong that experience too would be relevant, looking back on events that have occurred since that time. But I'd say since in those almost 50, 60 years that have ensued, ever since 1972, I think up until about a decade ago, Americans thought of the U.S.-China relationship as a positive-sum game, a win-win, as the Chinese like to call it. And you always, when you have a dialogue with the Chinese, they're always saying, well, let's make this a win-win situation. But then the question is, how do you do that? Is it really? And are there some areas where, at the moment, we're not exactly in a win-win posture? And if so, what are we going to do about it? I was thinking of your 5 categories there, Kevin, about how what our approach to China must be anchored in. And of course, buried in there somewhere is what about the really intractable problems, and how do we manage those? The South China Sea, some of the difficult economic issues that we confront, and which are going to no doubt come up in the phase 2 economic negotiations, and which were not really dealt with in the first round, intellectual property, cybersecurity, and so forth. So we've got tremendous challenges. But what I would like to ask Kevin in the first instance is to maybe talk, if you could talk to us a little bit more about China's worldview. I remember attending a CSIS meeting at which the foreign minister of China outlined 5 principles of Chinese foreign policy. And the 5th one, somewhat to my surprise, was to uphold the global order that was established after World War II. And so could you interpret that point for me? And I mean, do they still make that argument? Is that their view?
They do, except I would say, just one word in Chinese, 有中国特色的国际制度, which is a world order with Chinese characteristics. And there is an emerging literature on this. I think the key text for us to look at here, John, and China is a country of texts, is the Central Party Work Conference on Foreign Affairs in November of 2014, which has never been, Xi Jinping's address to it has never been released in full. But there you see a really interesting phrase, which in my judgment had been used for the first time in the modern period, that is the post-78 period. And that is, we in China are now engaged in a struggle for the future of the global order. Douzheng. And I remember reading this at the time in the People's Daily and said, whoa, struggle's back. Those of us who read the history of the Cultural Revolution understand the centrality of the concept of struggle. And if you've read your Marxist text, you understand the centrality of struggle as a core concept of that ideational worldview. So I then began looking at what do they actually mean by this. So my best articulation of it's along these lines, John, in practical diplomatic terms. The existing institutions of global governance, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the rest. China's posture since 2014, pushing Deng's axiom of hide and bide to one side, has been to, through financial investment, the deployment of personnel, and changing the culture of these pre-existing institutions of global governance, all in a direction more accommodating of Chinese national interests and values. And you see this across the UN institutions. There are, I think, 5 UN-related institutions now which are headed by PRC Chinese. 4 since the purge of the head of Interpol, who was convicted for corruption just the other day in China. But prior to that conviction, there were 5. That's unprecedented. And so you see this also emerging in China's funding for particular global institutions. For example, Wendy will soon convene here a meeting on the future of WTO. I was speaking to WTO officials not long ago about now the fact that their overwhelming funding source for the research activities the WTO Secretariat in Geneva comes from China. And as you go across the UN agencies and the Bretton Woods institutions, you see previous Chinese, as it were, passive engagement with those institutions, rolling with the consensus, whatever the consensus happened to be, except when Taiwan questions came to the fore, to now an unprecedented Chinese activism across these institutions. And for the first time in recent diplomatic history, Chinese multilateral initiatives, whether it's on Afghanistan or other questions that form central parts of the global political agenda. That's part A of what I see as being the struggle for the global order. Part B is China, in parallel to that, creating a new set of institutions beyond the UN Bretton Woods institutions of the 44-45 settlement. Whether that's the Belt and Road Initiative, which now has 70 plus participating states, depending on your definition, whether it's obviously the classical debate around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank, or others, or the parallel foreign policy and security institutions, whether it's the ongoing evolution of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, SICA, let's call it the Eurasian Security Organization, plus China's own +1 arrangements around the world, 16+1 in Eastern Europe, now 17+1 with the Greeks, ASEAN +1, the Latin American arrangements now, where you have CELAC plus China now meeting separately. So what you see is the emergence of a parallel set of institutions. So what's the final Chinese roadmap? Not sure. But what I know about our Chinese friends is they're proceeding on both fronts simultaneously, and they'll ultimately see what shakes down.
Mm-hmm. So the Chinese, this does also raise the question about whether at certain points in the recent past, if we had had a little bit more inclusive attitude towards China, that some of these initiatives that you described may not have taken place. I'm thinking, for example, of the capital expansion of the IMF, or greater opportunities for China to participate in those very existing institutions that they say they want, and that order that they wanted to defend. And I think we've tended to be quite protective of our relatively exclusive role in these instances. We've been literally the predominant influence.
And the subtext in Beijing is not just protective, but racist.
Okay.
No, I mean, I'm just reflecting an uncomfortable reality that this was a post-44, 45 settlement by a bunch of white guys. Look at the San Francisco conference, look at Bretton Woods, and they say, well, now there's a whole new world, which is 50 nation states has become 193. We Chinese have some status with the rest of, let's call it the non-white old colonial world. Now, I don't say that to defend the Chinese position, but to describe it. And when you get beyond polite diplomatic parlance, they say, yeah, we just saw a whole lot of doors shutting.
Right. But my point would also be that we have protected the status quo for such a long time that I think some of these developments that you described became inevitable. Look at the debate, and it's a very logical one, but it doesn't mean it's going to change, about the composition of the permanent membership of the Security Council of the United Nations. Everybody absolutely agrees that the reality of today is not the reality of 70 years ago, and yet it's proven impossible to figure out a way to how to reform the Security Council of the United Nations, and countries that ought to have maybe a more prominent place in that institution don't. And the existing members of the Security Council just sort of protect the status quo. So, I mean, you do have that debate. But this also goes to the issue of China's global aspirations. I mean, China's attitude is frequently described as wanting to push us out of Asia, so to speak, or certainly out of the East Asia Pacific region. I don't think they appreciate the ascendant position we've had in that part of the world. And very often in the dialogue that we have with our Chinese counterparts, it manifests itself in terms of, well, you know, what are these alliances that you have that were created so long ago, i.e. Japan and Korea? And really, you know, we need some kind of a new order the East Asia-Pacific region. I think the South China Sea is a manifestation of that. But my question, and I think I can understand roughly China's aspirations in the East Asia-Pacific region. I think they're going to meet with our resistance, and they're probably not going to be able to significantly alter our position. But what are their pretensions beyond the Asia-Pacific region? Do they aspire to be a global geopolitical power, notwithstanding their protestations to the contrary? Or do they still protest to the contrary?
I think the honest answer to that is, while that's not a phrase that China uses to self-describe, when the proposition is put by others around the world, China doesn't necessarily protest in the way perhaps it once would have, I should say. To back up briefly on your, I think, correct analysis about East Asia, I think that's true. China's actually made no bones about this. It's been quite plain. They see the alliance structure of the United States and East Asia as, quote, a Cold War mechanism. They think they should stop. Clear part of Chinese declaratory policy. They don't, beat around the bush with all of that. And you might say, well, why? Or what's driving China on this? I think its own sense of, as it were, integrity of its nation state, given the proximity of US surveillance flights, etc., to the Chinese coast. Secondly, particular military contingencies around Taiwan, which therefore mean that you need to push, from a Chinese perspective, the Americans back to the second island chain in order to create the political and military circumstances, or the military and political circumstances, to regain Taiwan. And then drawing on more ancient precedents from Ming and Qing times, a view that East Asia forms part of the wider Sinic world, that is China world, Sino world, or China's natural area of influence, whether it's John Fairbanks' notion of system of tributary states, or wider concepts when you roll in, for example, the inner North Asian neighbours. And China's organising principle in all of that has been one of its own internal security. Given that in Chinese history, multiple occasions, externals invaded the country successfully and actually then took control of the country. Anyway, that's China's primary preoccupation, as you know. On the Taiwan question, from their perspective, this work is ongoing and is not complete. Therefore, the level of geopolitical and geostrategic attention to the world beyond East Asia is much less. The caveat is what in this town is now called the Indo-Pacific, where China, through a combination of the land-based Silk Road Initiative, but the Maritime Silk Road, is now unfolding a new set of relationships which have not just an economic component, but increasingly a security component as well. If you look at port developments, whether it's in Cambodia, or whether it's in Myanmar, whether it's in Bangladesh, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Pakistan, or whether it's the new Chinese naval and military base in Djibouti. Which
okay, except for the Djibouti one, the other ones are arguably in their near abroad, wouldn't you say? I mean...
Well, I don't know if you could argue that Pakistan is the near abroad, Gaidar, or that Sri Lanka is the near abroad, or for that matter that even Bangladesh is necessarily the near abroad. And as you know, Bangladesh doesn't fall within the strategic remit of East Asia, even in Chinese classical historiography. So that's actually a new terrain. You know how these things are in Chinese rationalizations justified. Well, we're there because we're protecting sea lines of communication. All of our energy comes out of the Gulfies, not all of it, but a large slice of it. How can we rely upon Uncle Sam to defend our slocks? We can't. Therefore, we've got to do it ourselves. Then there's piracy, and therefore this requires a more advanced Chinese naval presence. And if you look at the numbers, on a continuing basis, there are about 4 or 5 units, that is ships of the PLA Navy, plan on continuing active deployment, let's call it the Indian Ocean. This is something of a shift, big shift as of a decade ago. Does it equal, however, US naval resources anchored in Bahrain? No. Before you roll in Pacific Command. So I think that deserves its consideration in terms of a future geopolitical role. And the wider thing I would just add to this part of the conversation is we need to look carefully at what China is now contemplating in its general strategic relationship with the Russian Federation. Long debate in its own right. But let's ask ourselves this question: why on earth is the People's Liberation Navy plan conducting naval exercises with the Ruskies in the Mediterranean and the Baltic? Now, these don't happen often, but what's all that about? So I've often said to PLA leaders in Beijing, what the hell are you guys doing? I mean, I understand, the normalization of Russia-China relations, the whole history of 400 years. I understand what you're doing in East Asia with our Russian friends, but in the Atlantic? And so why is it, therefore, that the most recent NATO communique, for the first time, names China as both a challenge and an opportunity? Now, I stand to be corrected on this, but in previous NATO communiques, I have not seen China named as being a relevant factor to the North Atlantic Treaty Area. This is new. So I think there's an incomplete answer to your question, but there's an Indian Ocean bit, there's a Gulf bit on energy security, and there's a Russia bit. And finally, there's a cyber bit and space bit, which, as you know, transcends neat geographical spheres of influence and interest because it becomes global.
But meanwhile, would it not be safe to say that their predominant strategic priority is in their own neighborhood?
Yeah, which is why, in answer to your question, I said, here's their set of rationales for East Asia, right, which remains dominant.
Yep.
It's at least 3/4 of the game and 3/4 of the strategic energies of the country.
That's an interesting proportion.
But don't forget BRI, don't forget the Indian Ocean, don't forget the Gulf, and whatever is unfolding with the Russians and what's happening in cyber and space create new, more global realities. But it's at best 1/4 of the game.
And interestingly, some of these developments in recent times, the more concerned that the rest of the region becomes because of their behavior, and the more concerned we might become, the greater expressions of support we make to countries like Japan. On the one hand, the alliance has, I'd say, gotten stronger in the last several years. And even in the case of Taiwan, I think we've done a number of things to bolster our relationship with that country. So it's kind of interesting that there's an action and a reaction involved in that situation. Could I just take you, before we open it up to questions, to one economic question? We've gotten through phase 1 of the economic negotiations, and we don't know when phase 2 will start. Perhaps it'll be after the next elections. I don't know what will happen between now and November, but what do you visualize in that? And I have in mind particularly some of these intractable issues that were somewhat finessed in the first round. But where do you see the economic relationship heading? And I guess related to that, isn't this a critical element in introducing a little bit of stability into the relationship? If you've got we have some of these other concerns, strategically, politically, or otherwise, if we can get the economic relationship on some kind of normalized footing, it would seem to me that that would be an extremely important accomplishment.
I think the best way to look at the Phase 1 deal is to see it as a ceasefire. But it's 停战. But I wouldn't go beyond that, to be quite honest. And it's a ceasefire within within one part of the wider economic relationship. Phase 2 in the trade bit has yet to be done, and the core unresolved business of Phase 2 is the future of Chinese state subsidy for Chinese firms operating in the global market. And I don't believe that has any probability of achieving agreement, because you go to the absolute core of the Chinese state model, the core of the Chinese state capitalist model, as I was seeking to describe it before. And I therefore see, if I could be blunt about it, not based on information, but just purely on analysis, I don't think it's in either side's interest, political interest, to see if the Phase 2 deal conclude and or fail this side of a presidential election in this country. So we're going to have a very protracted set of negotiations, I think, possibly about negotiations, about the parameters of Phase 2. So, but what does that bias? That biases a ceasefire in the trade war, and I'm always of a view that ceasefires are better than no ceasefires. It's just an old-fashioned view, but I'm basically a peace guy at heart. I prefer people not shooting, but that's just, maybe it's just an Australian view of the world. But it's also bad for the global economy, as you know from your own deep experience, John. But so therefore, what do I see? That this ceasefire stabilizes financial markets this year. Materiality of the actual Phase 1 deal, I'm not sure will alter the intrinsic dynamics of the U.S.-China trade. The huge open question is, given the magnitude of the proposed purchasing orders by China of United States goods to the tune of $200 billion additional dollars worth of Chinese imports from this country over 2 years. My God, you talk about the 13th five-year plan. The Americans have now devised, the 14th. It's purely that. I mean, it's a state-determined purchasing policy, something which Stalin would have dreamt of and never been able to execute. Now, how are you going to implement that? I've got no idea. Because you only get big numbers by doing massive long-term deals on LNG. Well, goodbye to your Australian allies, gone, because that's our principal export to the Chinese these days. Huge deals in agriculture in areas like beef and wheat. Well, goodbye Australia again, because we become the sacrificial offering up the middle of this economic relationship.
Yeah, but we've given you exile, Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking of my country, actually, not my personal circumstances. Leaving aside the deliverability and doability of the actual purchase, which would give most Chinese corporations food for thought. So all I'm saying is ceasefire, yes, 12 months. Don't expect a Phase 2 deal this side of a presidential election. It's my core analysis, I think, for respective political interests on both sides. Neither would wish to either concede or concede defeat this side of a US presidential election, and the Chinese want to see who wins the presidential election before they see how serious the next administration is on the prosecution of what is left to do. But finally, on the rest of the economic relationship, the technology decoupling continues to unwind. The intensity of the Huawei 5G debate in Europe is huge. Boris Johnson apparently is due to make a decision today or in days. Already did. What is it? Okay, well, that'll lead to its own epistemological debate about what the core part is. So it sounds like a great British fudge to me, but not that I've ever accused the British of fudging before. The German debate is fascinating. The Chinese have said if you rule out Huawei, then the German car industry will suffer in terms of its markets in China. So the technology decoupling on that, I think, it's simply the appetizer for what becomes a wider binary technological debate between the two countries, for which I think the next piece of meat on the table could well be semiconductors, and then the wider remit of, let's call it, artificial intelligence. So we may have a temporary ceasefire on trade. Where it goes to in terms of the other categories of economic engagement or decoupling between the two countries is a much more complex question. What I see, however, on the technology drivers is the binaries becoming sharper, not narrower.
And isn't that another area where diplomatic effort could well be concentrated? If we wanted to think about what's the long-term impact of the eventual decoupling of our two economies. I'm not saying it's going to happen across the board, but if it happens in the technological area, it could lead to decoupling in other ways. And then I guess that comes down to your judgment as to, well, how bad would it be for both the global economy and for our own respective economies if there was this decoupling?
It'd be several percentage points off global growth.
Perhaps to say the least.
And therefore, this calculus needs to be carefully contemplated, both in Beijing and Washington, against the other calculus, which is already clearly underway in both capitals, about what a decoupled technological world would mean for them nationally, against what they've separately concluded as he who takes the commanding heights on artificial intelligence for the 21st century is he who wins the 21st century. In other words, a binary national debate about that against what you and I know to be the awesome, phenomenal economic impact of this deep wrenching of the two economies apart. So what do you do about it through the agency of diplomacy? I'm just a simple Australian guy looking at this stuff. And but being an active little think tank, we've been thinking about this, because that's what think tanks do, we think. And then we tank. No, sorry. And particularly if you think too much. Sorry. We should do a Groucho Marx routine as well. But when I look at the AI world as it's unfolding, and the high-tech world as it's unfolding, think through this. We've focused hugely on what happens in the information technology world, telecommunications world, and prospectively the AI world. But what about biomedical research? Where actually the potential beneficiaries are the human families of both countries. What about the ability to use Chinese big data in the rapid testing of cancer treatment drugs, which can be thrown onto the American and global markets much earlier, much more effectively, more rapidly than current testing timelines. Now, actually, take cancer treatment drugs, as a case study. And we are chairing an engagement between MSK in New York, Sloan Kettering, and Chinese counterparts, most recently held in Guangzhou, on what we can do. And already you see through emerging protocols between the two sides, and drugs already gone to market in the United States, one of which I can recall, which have been exclusively tested in China and done in a narrow period of time because of the size of Chinese data, human data availability. In less than a year, what would take this country normally 7 years. So therefore you have a very human story about the benefit of deep collaboration. I'm not blind to all the other difficulties which exist in terms of Chinese biomedical research and the other protocol issues which arise in terms of data privacy, data availability, as well as, let's call it, broader questions of medical ethics. I'm aware of all that. But you ask what can be creatively done to make real and concrete.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think I'm with the thrust of your remarks, and as a former director of national intelligence, I'm more than aware of some of the complications that would be involved in negotiating about the theft of intellectual property and so forth. But what you're suggesting, and it's obviously for another day, but is this broader issue of whether the two countries ought to engage in a much bigger scientific dialogue between them. Where is science going?
If you and I were on Weibo this morning,
Yeah.
talking to 100 million Chinese, 15 million of which are in Wuhan, and said, do you think Australia, do you think United States and China should have an immediate, concentrated scientific research collaboration on the development of vaccines for the treatment of viruses like the coronavirus, or on this? I think you'd get a majority of 14.9 million to 1. Of course, this is just self-evident. If we had an outbreak of a communicable disease here, which was exotic, which is always possible, these things transcend geopolitics, like climate. And so therefore, on the question of agency and diplomacy, when I look at my category 4 of my 5-part hierarchy, push out in these areas of climate collaboration and, frankly, global communicable diseases, because these are common challenges for the human family.
Right. Well, we need to go to questions from... Yes, go ahead. If we could get a microphone, if you would please identify yourself and ask a question.
Good morning. My name is Sanjin Choi, Langham Partners. Ms. Prime Minister, Ambassador, thank you very much for lucid and succinct, insightful, and fact-based remarks. So my question
that was John, by the way, the fact-based remarks.
Both. Yeah. And so my question to you in economic issues, in 2019, Chinese GDP growth was the slowest one, and 6.1%, I guess slowest put it past 29 years. And also Chinese confronting with a low birth rate. So my question to you, Prime Minister, what are the short-term challenging issues for Xi Jinping? And second, EU President Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen said she will create a geopolitical commission. Would you offer your views? Thank you very much.
Let me just answer the point about a couple of Xi Jinping challenges, because that's a vast topic. But two immediate ones, and you've partly touched on them, is those of us who assume the permanent linear nature of China's economic development need to always bear two things in mind. Demography is a destiny. China's national workforce began shrinking in size 3 years ago. Population will peak sometime in the 2020s. With an aging population, the ultimate contest in Chinese domestic politics will be between the budgetary allocations for China's health and aged care and social security system on the one hand versus the PLA on the other. So think through that as a
welcome to the club.
Welcome to the club, and that's what it's actually what I say to my Chinese interlocutors: 欢迎到我们的世界来, which is these things are challenges for us all. And the second is that China's economic success up until now has depended on a unique form of Chinese political economy. And the political economy model has been one in the post-Deng period, which basically said this: we, the Chinese Communist Party, will maintain control over ideology, we'll maintain central political control, and we're going to create more and more space for the Chinese private sector so you guys can go out there and create wealth. And if you've seen that great formulation by Chinese Vice Premier Liu He in recent times, starting in late 2018, which is called the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 formula, which is we, the private sector in China, generate more than 50% of the tax, 60% of the employment, 70% of the innovation, 80% of something else. I can't remember what the rest of the sequence was. He was saying to the whole Chinese body politic, including to Xi Dada, Uncle Xi, guess what? We don't have a vibrant private sector in this country. We can't assume that this is going to continue. So here's the second challenge, and I'll stop at this. If, as Xi Jinping further centralizes political control and seeks to create further constraints around the free operation of the private sector, of which there's been some manifestation in the period of 16, 17, and 18 in a number of policy domains, the most important of which is credit policy, then suddenly you have a whole new set of weights in the saddlebag for China's historical growth assumptions, even against the natural slowing of economic growth in any country's economic evolution. Changing in midstream the political economy of the country and not correcting course is the second big, I think, fundamental challenge for China's leadership.
Yes, in the back there.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. Two questions. One on Huawei, the Defense Department's slowing of the Commerce Department's dictates on export controls because of their concerns about what it would do to American chip makers. If y'all have a thought on that, on what that bodes. And then on the ceasefire, of course, the vast majority of tariffs are still in place. Do y'all have any thoughts on if there's a different president next year, Biden, Warren, or Sanders, what they might do on those tariffs?
These are both profoundly American questions. What do you think, John?
Well, I mean, on the first point, I think it's the Department of Defense's way of finally somebody calling to our attention that this issue is more complicated than it may seem on the surface, and that there are actually some beneficial transactions that are taking place between Huawei and different elements of our economy. And if I remember correctly, there's been some kind of license exception put in for every several months, and the Commerce Department repeatedly has been renewing them. So, I mean, this technological war is going to be complicated if that's what we enter into. On your second point, I dare not speculate other than to say that there is the issue of whether there will even be a serious phase 2 negotiation, or whether we might go back to the drawing boards in some way, shape, or form. I just don't know.
No, I think we will have a ceasefire under current terms on trade for 2020. Right. Beyond that, fasten your seatbelts. Anybody could go anywhere. And I think that's both from the Beijing and the Washington perspective.
Although I guess we should add that, I mean, concerns about China's behavior, both political, geopolitical, and economic, it's not a partisan issue, I think, in this country. I think there's a fairly strong bipartisan, it may be amorphous, somewhat amorphous, but there is a consensus of sorts. I mean, you go all the way back to Chuck Schumer and the currency manipulation and so forth. There have been people on both sides of the aisle who have had apprehensions about China's rising economy.
Well, neither of us know that. And, President Trump is Captain Tariff. He loves this stuff. I think it's economic madness myself, because I have a very old-fashioned, for a center-left progressive like me, I just have a very old-fashioned view that free trade's good for everybody. I know that's unfashionable these days, particularly coming from the center-left, where I come from. But it does, it has in our national experience and across the economic history of modern East Asia been the central driver of rapid economic growth. And if you close your economies, guess what? You tend to engender the reverse. My only footnote, by the way, on chips and semiconductors and even supercomputers, you spend a bit of time with the semiconductor industry in this country, as I have, and you speak to those girls and guys about their industry. Their ability to reinvest to make this country so dominant in the semiconductor industry of the world hangs in large part on their ability to continue to export to China. So if we're going to shut that door, leaving aside whether the Chinese can become nationally self-reliant across the whole realm of chips and semiconductors, or not, if America, the US government, thinks that it is doing an enormous national service to shut that door to that industry's future growth, then will the United States government then step in as a massive additional step of industry policy to supplement in the order of tens of billions of dollars each year the current private R&D effort by that industry to remain global leaders. So this is a really complex equation for what is an enormously dynamic industry of which this country should be proud. I mean, your national capacity in chips and semiconductors is formidable. Between yourselves, Intel and other companies, add in TSMC and Taiwan and throw in Samsung, you're it for the world. And, you know, it's a great tribute to you. So just be very careful, I think, about where that all goes.
Gentleman way in the back there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We got to get you a microphone. Thanks.
Jacob Grieber from the Australian Financial Review. Thanks for taking my question. Just a quick
Mr.
follow-up.
Grieber.
Just a quick follow-up on the Huawei comment that you made, and it links to the broader industry policy thing I think you were just alluding to. What do you think of Britain's decision in the last few hours to basically take a softer line on Huawei than Australia and the United States have? What does that mean for that Five Eyes relationship? And what does it mean then for countries like Australia and the United States on this particular issue of 5G if we are pulling down the shutters? How do we get the alternative access to this technology?
I will duck and weave on the latter because I don't wish to provide a generalized answer which isn't reflective of the realities which the industry faces in Australia. So I just want to park that one to one side. You asked me specifically, however, about the British decision, its implication for Five Eyes. As evidenced by my earlier answer here, I haven't read the full text of the British decision. I hadn't even read the news reports when I worked in here this morning. So I'm always careful about commenting on stuff that I don't know. I've been very mindful of the fact that you had recent statements attributed to the US administration that unless Britain went America's way on Huawei and 5G, not only would the Five Eyes relationship potentially suffer, but so too would the speed with which the United States transacted a bilateral free trade agreement with the United Kingdom as well. I've seen that as well. So, but I also know, and you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar in politics to work this out, that Boris and the Trumpster get on pretty well. It sounds like a movie, doesn't it? Boris and the Trumpster. And so I know enough about politics to know that there will have been some dialogue up the middle of all this. So all I'd suggest is, rather than provide some dramatic or less dramatic minor headline from me in your paper tomorrow about good, bad, evil, good, blown up Five Eyes or not. I'd rather A, read the text, B, get a handle on the internal political level conversations which would have happened between Number 10 and the White House on this. I would think it inconceivable, given the advantages which the British provide to the Five Eyes relationship, that the Americans will just draw a line somehow and say that's it. It's just not in the nature of these relationships, which have evolved since 1945, for God's sake, and before. Secondly, when I said before, it sounds like a British fudge. Well, the Brits would say fudges are good because they can find your way through a welter of complexity. So what's the answer to the question? If I get the British decision correctly, it'll depend on the British decision or definition of the core. What core of the system will be, as it were, Huawei exempt or Huawei free? And I would rather see the detail of all that unfold before providing any definitive statement.
Over here. Great.
Thank you. Mike Anderson, retired Foreign Service Officer. You haven't said anything about the state of people-to-people ties. Would you comment on how things stand on that area in light of several of these points? One, Peace Corps, I understand, is pulling out of China. The status of the Confucian Institutes has become much more controversial. And the U.S. has placed controls on Chinese diplomats when they interact with government offices in the U.S. Any comment on any of those?
Yeah, none of them are particularly happy developments. But I'd make a broader point about the question which none of us can actually quantify. How do the two peoples feel about each other these days? You know, it's an old-fashioned view, but I think two peoples of these two countries still like each other and have actually a deep respect for each other. And let me just speak for the Chinese side of the equation first. In the midst of all this, the fact that you still have most Chinese families wanting to send their kids to university in this country, and if they can't get in for one reason or another, heading to Australia and the United Kingdom, Canada. I mean, that to me continues to speak volumes of where people who think first of their kids, particularly in Chinese traditional culture, entrust their kids for the future. Now, I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this, the extent to which there is now new realities. Universities are being warned by the United States security authorities and intelligence authorities to screen more carefully around the intake of Chinese students, particularly in given research programs. I'm not naive about the fact that China will continue to exercise scrutiny and greater scrutiny about foreign students in China for similar fears of espionage. But you know something? These and the history of this relationship have always existed and have been managed within the fabric of still a growing people-to-people relationship. So I think the key to this question lies in the ability of the universities of both countries to continue to manage their university-to-university links and for students to continue to be welcomed in the overwhelming majority of cases in both countries. If that gets stopped, we're into hell, frankly, because this has been so much the underpinning fabric of Sino-US relations for a century. If you go back to the late Qing, look at the first batch of Chinese students who arrived here. If you go back to, quote, the Boxer scholarships coming out of 1900, 1901, which educated generations of Chinese in this country. I mean, there are millions of 6-7 million Chinese now who have been through American universities since '78. Think about how this informs elite views in China of this country. It's huge. It's indirect, but it's palpable. You cut that off, I think, at each country's peril. And I really worry about, and I've given speeches on this before, is that whatever concerns the US intelligence security authorities have, they should be prosecuted technically, specifically, pointedly, and without triggering any form of new McCarthyism. That would really worry me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of an incipient scare, if you will, China scare going on. And I think it's influenced some of these things. But I noticed that the student numbers are still pretty high. I think they're upwards of 300,000 a year coming from China. Here's one. The question was asked earlier on trade and if there's a different party in power in the White House. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs did its annual study. I've always thought it to be a very interesting one on what Americans think about foreign policy. And there's a graph in there on which party or adherents of which party are more concerned about the U.S.-China relationship and more worried about the quote-unquote Chinese threat. And there's a clear discrepancy between Republicans and Democrats. So if a Democrat were to occupy 1,600... Yes, with the Republicans being more worried. And so I think if there were a change in the occupancy of the White House, that might affect this specific issue that you just raised. Now, you know, these things, that was a snapshot back in last September. I don't know whether things have evolved since that time. I guess we have time for one last question. Yes, ma'am. And we just get you a microphone.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Gelb. I work with Deloitte, but my question comes from, I used to live in Xinjiang, so I was wondering what role, if any, you thought human rights will play in this strategic competition. So I know the Senate has made some isolated efforts to address this, but it hasn't been a continued part of the negotiations. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about Xinjiang, what role it could play in this strategic calculus, and if there's any role for the global community to play.
On the question of human rights, it has been a constant in the U.S.-China relationship since diplomatic normalization in 1979, and that's not going to change. Secondly, China's approach, as you know, is that whether it's U.S. national protestations on human rights or actions such as those you've seen recently in the United States Congress, either on Xinjiang or Hong Kong, are none of America's goddamn business because these are internal affairs. We all know that that's the pattern of the exchange. But thirdly, it's also true that because policies in Xinjiang have changed under Xi Jinping, that both the reaction to the United States and by other countries around the world is going to get sharper and sharper. You saw that most recently through the UN resolutions on Xinjiang. But what's fascinating about the UN resolutions on Xinjiang is this. Look at the numbers. Those who took a position against China's policies in Xinjiang were frankly the Western club, by and large, with only one Muslim state, Albania. Of the 50-plus members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, our Chinese friends managed to get all of them to either vote with China or to abstain. And so therefore, the activism of Chinese defensive diplomacy around this question, right around the world, including in the Muslim world, has been a phenomenon to behold. And I think the Western community of nations around that particular resolution are still in some level of shock about how thin the overall vote was. In fact, from memory, there are about 23 votes in favour of the British-sponsored resolution. And I can't remember the number against and how many abstentions, but the actual reflection of the rest of the Muslim world was what I think stunned most international observers. So the final point is my own engagement with our Chinese friends on human rights, which has been direct privately, direct publicly, over many, many decades has simply been this. We recognize the improvement in the Chinese economy. We recognize the improvement in living standards right across China, and frankly, including in the most difficult parts of the country, including Xinjiang, Tibet, and elsewhere. However, we and China are both signatories and ratification states of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. China has signed but not ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. China has signed and ratified the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights. And so my counsel would be for those engaging China on these questions is anchor your positions in international law. Anchor your position in the covenantal arrangements which govern us all, rather than, as it were, selective episodic positions which we pull out of the air on a particular issue on a particular day. I find that is a much more systematic way in which to engage our Chinese interlocutors.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Kevin Rudd for excellent remarks. Thank you.
And thank you, John, for being part of the conversation, for answering all the hard American questions. It was a good division of labour. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today.
Thanks very much.